My name is Damon Grosmeter. I am a student here at Park University, and I worked in the archives over the last year or so in order to help digitize the Nisei collection.
My name is Dr. Timothy Westcott, Associate Professor of History at Park University and Associate University Archivist. Is probably the second or third most requested information from researchers, following a couple of other major collections. So it's one of those that we receive a lot of inquiries. We were able to obtain some grant money from the Missouri Library Association in order to get it digitized and get it up for the anniversary, but also then to share with some other organizations that deal with basically Japanese American internment. But just digitizing them, because they're searchable in that sense. So I think hopefully it will broaden that perspective and just provide an access to information that, it's been hidden now for 80 years unless you physically came to Parkville.
Overall, the process of digitization for the Nisei collection essentially worked with getting the primary source documents, figuring out who they were from, what year they were from, and what they were essentially about. Essentially figuring out whether they were for or against Dr. Young's initiative to bring Nisei students to Park, whether or not it was some of the student records of the Nisei students that he was able to. A large portion of it was Dr. Young's correspondence between himself and the students themselves, and with various government officials in order to figure out how many he could bring into Park, and a lot of unfortunate letters denying requests because they were limited to a set quota of how many Nisei students Dr. Young was able to help further their education. There were also, of course, a large quantity of for and against letters from both alumni and also citizens of Parkville. The dichotomy between the for and against were very interesting, but we had to figure out what the contents of the letters were, the postcards, whatever medium they were sent in. We would scan them and upload them to JSTOR. And then on JSTOR, we would have to fill in all the metadata, which included the names of the people who wrote it, what source they were from, what kind of medium it was, whether it was a letter or a postcard. So most of the documents were in pretty excellent condition. They're not that old, although I guess, to be fair, they're getting about 80 years old now. But most of the documents were in very good condition. Some of them were, one of the largest part was removing old staples from them that were starting to rust, and it was like, let's get that feller out of there. A lot of them were glued together, and that caused a little bit of challenge because you don't want to, while you're scanning them in, because it was just a typical, scanner. And so we, put it face down, scan it like you were doing a fax machine. The project took just under a year. There were two of us working on the digitization process, myself and my colleague Mark Lee. And we kind of 50-50'd it. So he did about half of the collection, uploading it, and I did the other half. One of the biggest parts of it that we had to kind of teamwork together was reading some of the handwritten documents. As a Gen Z person myself, my cursive handwriting is not great, and nor is my cursive reading. Although I will say, I'm much better at it now. Although there were still many times where we both had to look at each other, and some of the biggest challenges were getting the full context for what the item was, and then translating that into the metadata. So that way, when you look at the item, you would have kind of the full context of what is this document, what's it related to. Thankfully, most of it was already sorted by the time that I had gotten started on the project. Some of it was not, and so some of it we had to go back and look through and be like, okay, so where does this letter fit in? Is this one of the initial protests? Is this an alumni responding to the original request from Dr. Young? What is this document? Is it a government order? Is it part of a student file? And there were not that many, thankfully. There were students before us that had gone through and organized a lot of the filing that made it much easier to not have to start from that much of scratch. So.
I think culturally, if we look at our current uh, associations with the AAPI minority groups, we fit right into that. Right now, and making sure that we can tell that Asian American story. But I think also those stories also relate to our engagement with World War II and the denial of civil liberties, social justice statements. So I think the collection provides an opportunity for us to explain that historical narrative. And I think probably last would be even our own alumni. There are not that many alumni, unfortunately, still living that were here when the Nisei attended. All of the Nisei students that attended are now deceased. But I think just to carry on that story to even our more current students and that relationship of how we looked at a culturally diverse student body, an internationally diverse student body, basically since the 1880s when we accepted our first international student. But I also have to be careful because when you look at our history, is we were, since our founding in 1875, very proud of the fact that we provided a liberal arts education for both genders right from the start, a diverse demographics of students, Native Americans in the first class, and so on. And we have, and like I said, since 1880, we accepted international students. But there is one cloud in that history, and that is we did not accept our first African American students until 1952. We accepted students from around the world, and we employed some of the best staff here since 1875 were African American, but they could not send their children. So it's a juxtaposition, even on our own history, is how we would be willing, and I'm glad we did, take those 9 students out of those camps and bring them here for an education. But we would not educate African American students living literally across the street. But I also think it provides an opportunity, as Parkville's African American history is now attempting to deal with, it also provides an opportunity for us to reflect and grow as a community, as a larger community, from both events, our African American history and our history with the Nisei, not only as institutional, because we're connected to that, even the African American history, but then the Nisei history also. Even telling that story of Park and the role of the alumni, the role of the students even back then, stepping up and saying, no, hey, we want them and keep them safe and things like that. So I think it's a wonderful thing.
It really highlighted to me how much Park has changed. Because Park is no longer a religious institution, where it very much so was. And that was the big call for it, for Dr. Young, was, his message for everybody deserves an education, and especially these Nisei students who were being constitutionally, or having their constitutional rights violated by the federal government. it was interesting to hear and to learn the arguments that came from the community, because it wasn't everybody around that disagreed with it. It wasn't everybody was, doing it for racist reasons, or a lot of it was, I have sons and daughters that went overseas, or I lost a husband overseas, or a son, and they were a little irked at people not going over and fighting and instead staying at college. So it was interesting seeing and learning the place that the park community writ large in the Kansas City area had. I've been a resident of Kansas City my whole life, specifically North Kansas City in the Parkville area. So this is the area I grew up in, and it's very interesting to learn a lot of the history from that time frame.
Research inquirers come from all over the world. So we've had, local, regional, but also national. Particularly, we've worked with an organization called Densho, which is primarily Japanese American historical records, archives, museum. They're heavily involved in making sure the story is told and then preserving some of the internment camps that can be saved. So very prominent. They've been very helpful to our collection and have always been engaged with making sure that we share that information. So I think it would be an interesting continuation of the project to, in some institutions I've already worked with, have voluminous, like Drake, probably close to 1,000 documents himself. But then you go way to the other extreme, where some of the colleges don't have any records, maybe a yearbook photo. So we vary between collections. But I think it would be interesting for us to be able to assist in where we have a larger digitization of all those records within the Midwest.
I think it would be very good for this collection to be integrated with some of the other Nisei collections that are out there. It's definitely a portion of history that gets a little overshadowed. A lot of people focus on the Supreme Court, decision, or they focus on the internment itself, but not the actions of institutions trying to rectify some of the wrong that was committed. And so I would hope that there's some community coming together, if you will, around the Nisei collection to show history's not all full of bad people. There are good actors.
I think archives-wise, we're working on a couple of major projects. We have some phenomenal student publications that started in the 1880s that I think we'd like to finally sort of get digitized because those are wonderful. I think the second digitization project would be the Stylus student newspaper that started in 1895. Some of that's already online, but we have, and that's probably our second, maybe first inquiries that we get is old Stylus newspapers, articles. So I think that would be a major one to try to do. And then some of the current students that are here and would be continuing on for the next couple of years. One has started looking at the research and the breakdown of the John McAfee collection, where we can get a finding aid written and then get that digitized. And probably last, I think it'd be interesting coming up on the 150th anniversary of the university is to design and publish some sort, if not every 6 months, at least annually, a magazine for alumni and students and staff and faculty that tells our story. The archives is over 100 years old. We have some phenomenal stories. We have over 200 Bibles that come from around the world that our missionaries sent to us overseas, or on the home front, we would say, the home missionaries. So we have the stories to tell.